Hello and welcome to Fall Through, your source for deep conversations about software, technology, and computing. I'm Chris Brando, also known as Scriptable, and Angelica did a really great intro once again, so I'm going to leave that to her. I just want to let you guys know that this episode does have extended content, per usual, for our supporters. So if you want access to that, head on over to fallthrough.fm/subscribe and sign up today. And if you're not already following us on social media, please give us a follow there. We really do like interacting with y'all. And if you're watching this on YouTube, hit that like button, that subscribe button, and that notification bell so you can get notified right when we ship episodes. And with that, let's get into the show.
Hello, and welcome to today's episode of Fall Through. We're going to be discussing building for the future. Why should you care about building for the future when sometimes it feels like you don't know what your roadmap looks like a month from now, let alone the future? We're going to be chatting today with the wonderful Jon Sabados, who is joining us to give out some tips, tricks, ways of thinking about building for the future in the hopes of not only sharing his wisdom, but also helping you all who might need to build for the future have some frameworks, some questions to ask, some ways of framing the problems you're hoping to solve so that building for the future doesn't feel like such an insurmountable challenge. But before I introduce Jon properly, I'm going to introduce my wonderful co-host, Matthew Sanabria. Hello.
Hello, how you doing?
I'm good, I'm excited. It's super hot and gross outside, but it's cool and AC'd inside.
Oh yeah, I got tan again. I'm good. I'm back to my normal glow.
Again. I'm systemically pale. My mom's very kind and calls me an English rose, but really what that means is I just look like I've never seen the light of day ever.
That's okay. We have words for that too, vampires and such. It's okay.
Yeah, vampires. Don't tempt me.
I am excited for this episode though.
I am too.
The future is now. Like we're always in the future.
The future is now. So, pass over to our wonderful guest for today. He is a staff software engineer at the New York Times. He has over 2 decades of experience in software development in a range of different industries. Professionally, his primary passion is developing maintainable systems that can gracefully evolve over time. We love a graceful evolution to the future. He's largely opted out of social media, but he does have a website if you want to check him out, sabadoscodes.com. And he can occasionally be spotted streaming a sim race on Twitch. I've checked out some of the videos and they're quite good. How are you doing today, Jon?
I am doing well, although it's not quite as sunny, or it's not quite as sunny as here as it is in New York right now. It's actually a little bit overcast and gray, which is not the normal for Colorado. So I'm hoping maybe some of that sun comes our way.
You can have some of it. I think that's fine. I think me and Matthew would be cool with that. So we're going to start... you can have it. So we're going to start at the very beginning. Why should we build for the future? Like, why should those who are listening to this episode even care about building for the future when, as I mentioned, sometimes it's just trying to get something out in the next 2 weeks?
Well, actually, because of that exactly. So, if you know what your roadmap is for years on out, it's really easy to build in a long-term fashion where, you know what the future is going to bring and you don't have to think too much about it because you're planning for it all the time. But most often in today's world, requirements are changing constantly. And what you thought was a priority one minute might be in the back burner and a whole new priorities come down. So you need to be able to have systems where you can switch like that and switch priorities and continue to maintain your velocity and continue developing when priorities change without it just grinding to a halt. Because if you're constantly just ad hoc fixing fire after fire, you're going to quickly run into a situation where systems become a tangled mess and you don't even know where to begin to add this change. So basically, enabling that velocity and change, or velocity and throughput.
Got it. So really what you're saying is building for the future actually helps you deliver more effectively and iteratively.
Exactly. And it's kind of a compromise, right? Because anytime you're going to be building a new feature, there's different buckets, levers that you can pull. We're going to get this out fast. We're going to make it work well. We have to do it cheap, and you kind of have to pick 2 of those. And if you're constantly picking the fast and cheap route, you're going to get to the point where everything becomes expensive.
Got it. So you kind of mentioned this in terms of trade-offs, like picking, as you said. What are, in your mind, the different trade-off factors that people should be thinking about? What are those components that need to be weighed against each other?
Well, so you've got there's no science to it, and it's kind of more of an art, right? Because you might have a feature coming down where it is, world's on fire. We must get this out because there's going to be immediate revenue loss or impact. In that case, then yeah, you're probably looking at, well, get it out however we can, and we'll deal with the fallout of that later. But in an ideal world, you have time to kind of balance those risks. Something's going to be, it's going to take this certain cost to do it right. And that might be a dollar cost. It might be an opportunity cost where, if you're taking longer to work on it. So it really comes down to a balancing of, how soon can we get this out? How feature rich do we want it? Where can we make compromises? And then, your resourcing. So it's kind of a delicate balance that should involve like product engineering and EM all together to agree on a path forward.
And in terms of the way that you approach those trade-off conversations, you mentioned like it's between the EM, engineering manager, PM, product manager, as well as the, it could be engineering lead, it could be a staff engineer. Different companies have different frameworks of leadership for projects. Is this something in terms of evaluating the approach and that cost that you envision is most effective right at the start of a project? Or is this something that you should be reevaluating on a cadence? Before we kind of get into the nitty gritty of frameworks and various things to ask yourself as an engineer, I'm kind of interested in when you should be thinking about this. When is the decision made?
Well, so ideally, if you've got a clear roadmap where you've planned it out and, at a quarter and, you've got that long-term vision, but that's never the case. So usually it should happen as soon as possible. But it's also something that should evolve as you're going through it. Because usually when you're first presented with a problem, it's somebody saying, I want this. And you don't even know what the problem you're solving is yet, which is also a danger point in itself. But so, have those conversations and say, this is what we think it's going to take. But then once you dive in, you're always learning more as you go. So it needs to be a continual conversation that's happening as new facts come in, as you see timelines either increasing or, if you're really lucky, decreasing, although that's usually not the case, resurfacing that and then having those, check-ins and we're in danger of meeting this deliverable. And so this is what it means kind of thing.
Got it. And I'm going to turn to you now, Matt, because I'm sure you've had experience in this. Like, in your experience, like, is that typically a conversation that is prioritized at the beginning? I'm kind of interested, before we dive into how it should be done, to hear a little bit about how you've experienced it actually being done.
I don't know. It's been different on different teams too. And it depends on like what the project is or whatever you're working on. If it's the most important business impacty thing, then there is always going to be a tension between like, urgency and rigor, right? Like, do we make this scalable and thinking about the future? And do we know, you kind of have to look at your roadmap in the future and kind of extrapolate a bit. And maybe you try to solve for some of those problems today without crossing the bridge into premature optimization. Yeah. But then also you want to get something out to deliver value now. And I've just seen tension there a lot. And there's naturally going to be tension there. But I think a lot of the people on both sides tend to throw out the word premature optimization prematurely, right? Or they're like, don't do that. It's premature optimization. It's like, dude, it's going to take me 5 minutes to do this. And it's going to be such a good quality of life for now and in the future. Why wouldn't I take the 5 minutes to do this? And I think if you can have those conversations, I think you're thinking about building for the future right, in my opinion.
Got it. And for those who don't know for those who might not know what that phrase means, how would you define, like, what is premature optimization?
You want me to answer that?
Either, okay. Whomever would like to define that phrase.
I'll answer it quickly.
Because it's one that I had not heard of before, working as closely as I now do with engineers.
Yeah, I mean, the way I define it is solving for a problem that doesn't yet exist and may not ever exist. I think that it's a good definition of premature optimization, right?
Got it.
If you only have, tens or hundreds or thousands of users coming to your application, you don't need to solve for the scale of millions. And that's sort of how I define this.
Got it. Really helpful. Okay, so I feel like even in the beginning of this episode, we've talked about that like building for the future versus providing business value as two things that cannot both be done. It feels like they're very conflicting, but I want to dissect that a little bit. And I know I heard that inhale, Jon. I'm kind of leading the conversation here. But it seems like that is not the case, and it should not be thought about as either we can deliver value or we can build for the future. If you think about building for the future in the right way, you can do both. You can keep your business parties happy, but you can also be building in a way that is going to scale, is going to be for the future, is going to be flexible and agile enough to change as things change in, your users better, your tooling better, your scale better, your load, etc. So let's maybe start digging in a little bit on the like, what are the steps that you can think about when building towards the future when, as we've mentioned a number of times now, you don't know really what the future holds. And even if you do know, or you think you know, it might change.
So, I think one of the first things that you can do to ensure that you're actually building for the future is actually understanding the problem that you're solving. Because 9 times out of 10, when we get something in, I might be exaggerating a little bit, but it's really common to get, I want this thing, or I want this button, but without knowing what problem you're solving, that's a real quick way to start developing stuff that's going to be unmaintainable. So understanding your problem and starting at discovery is the correct point. And I'm not saying this is something where, you need to spend months and months and know the complete end state, because that'll also set you up in a bad way, because, you take 6 months building this wonderful shiny thing and then you put it out in front of a user and they're like, oh, this isn't what I meant at all. This isn't what it's going to need to do. And then you're refactoring a bunch of things and changing. You're starting with a bunch of cruft. And I guess that's also worth noting is building for the future is much easier when you're starting from a blank slate. Because usually when you're hitting the point where, now we're going to have to make this compromise and it's going to impact business and we can either deliver value or we can do it the right way, you're probably already in a hole and having to try and climb your way out. So also staying on top of it and keeping track of those compromises and making time to swing back and address them when it is determined that you had to take a shortcut. Sorry, I'm doing the thing where I trail off.
No, you're this is absolutely the place to think through. It's a conversation, and as with all conversations, we want to leave space to be able to think, because you're getting my creative juices going. I mean, in terms of even understanding like your user, what is the problem? Like where do you start? I feel like especially for these kind of problems where it might be a complete rebuild of a whole platform, a whole UI, a whole tool set. Sometimes I feel like, and I don't know whether this resonates, but it certainly does. I've seen it on engineering, but I've certainly felt it on the product side. It's this is such a huge problem to understand. Where do I even start?
So as for finding the smallest chunk that you can deliver that offers some value. So this is one where a lot of times in Agile, you'll see a model where we're going to break our works out into sprints, and then we're going to deliver this thing, and say the user's asking for a car. If you're doing it wrong, you'll start like, all right, well, we'll build pieces at a time. So first we'll build the tires and the suspension and whatnot. User can't use any of it. So then you go into your next stage. You say, all right, I've got a sprint done. Next, I'm going to build the frame, build the body. And so, by the end of when you're finally done, you deliver them a car and the user's like, okay, great, this works, I guess. But if you're doing it correctly, the first thing you're going to ask is approach it from a place of curiosity. Because, if you just come and say like, well, we need to understand your exact problem, blah, blah, blah. Kind of an aggressive tone, it's not going to work well. But approach from curiosity, be like, all right, well, okay, so I know you you want a car, what are you going to be using it for? Where are you going to be going? Is this going to be a showpiece that's living in a garage and is washed and cleaned and you take pictures of, or do you need to go to the grocery store often? And then they might be like, oh yeah, most of the time I'm just going to the grocery store down the block. And at that point, speaking metaphors, but you can take a skateboard and say, here you go. I know it's not really the best thing that you want, but it's going to be faster than walking. You can use it now. And a lot of analogs exist to that in the digital space where you can say, all right, it's going to take us a long time to build the final product, but I can make your life a little bit better now. And you give it to them and then you learn from it. So the person's on the skateboard and they're like, well, I really like the wind in my hair, but it's kind of sketchy and I don't feel safe. And so, it can evolve. And there's a diagram floating out there where it's do this, not that. With one starting off with the car pieces being built piece by piece, finally having a car. But in the other one that starts off with you hand them a skateboard, and then you progress to a bike, and then you progress to a motorcycle, and you discover the user really likes wind in their hair. And then your final product that you give them might be a convertible rather than that original car that you were going to develop for them.
Got it. So I think that speaks really clearly to that kind of iterative design, thinking about not giving the user exactly what they tell you that they want right at the beginning. And kind of to dig into that a little deeper, how do you make sure, what are some things you can ask yourself, that you're solving the right problem? Because I feel like we've seen this happen, I'm sure it happens pretty often, where a user, or even, I'm going to say it, your product manager, sometimes will tell you, this is what we need to do, this is the problem we need to be solving. But upon further scrutiny, asking the right questions, it might be that the problem you thought you were solving is actually less important than the true problem that emerges. I'm just interested whether it's questions that you ask your product manager when evaluating the problem they're presenting, or as you're digging into engineering discovery, some things to be cognizant of to really pressure test that before you even think about how are we going to solve the problem and like who are the users, etc. Just evaluating that initial problem statement. I'm interested how you think about evaluating and really pressure testing that.
Well, so the first thing I'm going to ask is, can I draw success criteria from this problem statement? And yes, you can always draw success criteria from, yes, I put a button there, but really I'm talking about that end result. And you can say, this is the value that we're providing, because this is also going to help when it comes to later conversations. User wants to do this, that's going to enable this functionality, and that's ultimately going to affect revenue in this way. So having those things where you can then also make the cost benefit analysis and say, well, if they want this really great thing that everybody's going to love, but it's only going to impact revenue in a very minute fashion. So we need to factor that in. We might not, throw massive RDS instances that are going to cost thousands a month for something that's only going to yield, a couple $100 a month.
Got it. So once you have your problem, I would love to talk a little bit about the other pieces of user discovery. Like who is your user? Like, how do you understand them? How do you think about them? Typically, I know that this might be in collaboration with a designer or even directly the users. But I'm interested in how you move from that, okay, we have our problem, but who are our users? Who are we solving this for? Because often that will change the approach and the way we think about solving it.
Yep. So this is one where it's really nice to have an actual UX expert or UX team. And I'm not talking, not just design and this is the way that this looks, but somebody who's thinking the whole user experience through. And, if they're thinking of things like accessibility and whatnot that most engineers normally aren't. But if you don't have that, then it does make life a little bit harder. And that's where the more conversations that you can have, the better. If you're able to watch somebody using something great, pick somebody who's not into tech at all. So, it might be your parents. It might be your girlfriend who's into art and doesn't touch tech at all, and throw it in front of them and see what they do. So trying to view things from a perspective of somebody who's not a technology expert can go a long ways.
Got it. So really bringing it back to, as I've heard some people describe it, like thinking about it from the most simple users, almost basic users' point of view, before you add that additional layers of complexity and you make it a little bit more intuitive. I.e., sometimes people think about it as like, think about the problem and explain it like you were talking to a 2-year-old, or start from the very bare minimum, no bells and whistles, no additional things, just going to your users and going, hey, what is the bare minimum thing that you need to solve your problem? To go back to your analogy around the skateboard and then the scooter and then the bike and then the motorbike and then the car, you might find that actually your user absolutely loves their new motorbike. They don't want a car. They actually love the motorbike, and they're just going to keep going doing that. They don't need to iterate any further, at least at that point. So I think that's a really good way of framing it. Once you've got your problem and then you start thinking about applying it to your user, again, even before thinking about how we're going to do this, which I know is the next phase, is really bringing it back to the basics. Because I think often, and I'm sure we all resonate with this, you get so curious or like excited. You're, oh, there are so many ways. This is so fun. Let me get curious about this problem. And I think about this problem, and then I think about this other problem that's related to it that would be really fun for us to solve. And I think sometimes it can get all in a muddle. I don't know.
Well, and again, I also would stress going back to what's the problem they're trying to solve. So the more that you ask, how do you want this solved, you're probably going to end up going back and forth and straying from that what is it you're trying to do thing, and focusing on the what is it you're trying to do more than what do you want to have in front of you, if that makes sense.
No, it does.
This is a tough one. I mean, I've been guilty of like going down the rabbit hole. I've been guilty of, being, procrastinating and not starting quick enough and whatever. I've also, like I told my wife with our chocolate shop, you kind of have to tell the user what they want to some extent, right? You should ask the user and talk to them and see what the market is and see what they want, especially in technology when you're building for your users specifically. But you also do have to tell them what they want too, because if you keep asking them what they want, it'll probably be something that's not really beneficial for the users at large. So you kind of have to just be like, you know what, I'm hearing you, but here's what you actually need. I've heard all your problems, and what you actually needed is different than what you told me you needed. And that's part of like this whole solutions sort of discovery, right? How do you discover what are the concrete things that you're going to implement to solve the user's problems? And this can be something as simple as, oh, I'm going to build a web app, and the web app is going to do X, Y, and Z. Or this could be as simple as, there's too much going on here. I'm going to set like a standard up front saying, this is V1, right? And I don't really like the phrase MVP, V1, or whatever, but you do kind of have to sometimes say, this is what's included for right now, and this is what's excluded. So this is a long-winded way of asking the question of how do you like start your solutions discovery?
Well, I also couldn't stress enough the importance of getting something out there as soon as you've got something that can benefit somebody in any way, shape, or form, even if it seems mild. The sooner you can get it in front of somebody for feedback, the better. So I'd say don't be afraid to put an unfinished piece of work in front of somebody, so long as it provides value. Now that does have to be balanced a little bit, but if you're releasing something to the general public, then you want it to be a lot more polished. But if you're working on internal tooling, and you've got a good relationship with your users, you can be like, hey, this might blow up in our faces, but let's pick a low risk thing to try it out on and see how it goes, so we know what we can work more on.
I've seen engineers like spin their wheels on this, like we were talking about, and kind of do that analysis paralysis sort of rabbit hole there, where there's so many options, so many ways you can go, and you're trying to analyze them to completion rather than actually taking time to implement and learn things that way. And I've been guilty of this too, but I think it's a different paradigm, right? I've seen colleagues, former colleagues, I've seen them, or even just like observed other colleagues, regardless of their role, if they're an engineer or a PM or whatever their role is, I've seen them take the rigor hard stance to the extreme, to the point where they're like, there's an absolute one way correct way to do this thing, and we're going to do that thing at the expense of either A, never shipping anything to a customer because you're trying to go so correct that it's taking you way too long to implement anything, or B, which I think is even worse, pissing off your teammates. Because we've all probably been around that rigorous sort of engineer that's like, no, there's a correctness. This is engineering. It's binary 10 10 10. And it's like, it's not binary. You're building for users who are by definition like very non-binary, not in the gender sense, but in the like, you know, sense of spectrums that we all operate. Like Angelica might have a preference for this, and I might have a preference for that, and you might have another preference there. So there is no this or that. There's this and that. And that I think makes it really, really difficult when you're trying to start and even ship features, because you can ship something that helps someone because you know it's valuable now. But then if you take that away to ship something better, you might be also pissing people off and shipping something beneficial, but also taking something away. And I just find this tension to be really, really tough. And this is where just talking to your teammates, talking to your users just becomes so important, and just kind of laying out an expectation, or dare I say a contract, of how you interact with your users.
Well, and that also leads me to, you know, understanding what can be easily changed versus what can't. Because, you know, if we're working with digital stuff, it's not like we're building a bridge and we're like, we've got to change it. So that means we got to scrap the whole thing and start from scratch. You can generally change a lot of things on the fly, and mistakes are easy to undo, except for a couple places, and like data. So any persistent data is something that is very difficult to change. So, you know, you want to make sure you've got an understanding of that and are storing your data in a way that is manageable. Because if you've got to change that, you're probably looking at an outage. So, you know, if you start out on like using flat files in S3, and then you're like, oh wait, no, we need an RDBMS. We're going to have to take an outage to migrate things, or have an insanely complex or writing to most places at the same time and syncing data and whatnot. And then the next level of contracts is one that I'm big on, that contracts are hard to change when you've got two systems talking to each other. And, you know, you can add new fields, no problem, but you're like, oh, we want to rename this field. And now you have to coordinate that between multiple systems and so on. So code's easy to change, data and contract very much so different.
I want to kind of bring us back a little bit to the very good question like Matt you were talking about, which is where you have those multiple options. You can do it many different ways. People have different preferences. Kind of operationally, what are some ways that you can get to a decision effectively when there are loads of different options, ways to do the same thing, especially if it's a more quote unquote simple thing to do? We want to set up some recurring schedule for a message to be sent. You're going to do a cron job. You're going to set up some kind of event-based trigger. Like, are you going to set up a schedule service? Like, when there's a lot of different ways, you know, where there's no clear answer, which honestly, I feel like with most problems, especially technical problems, there is never really a right way, or like, don't even talk about the right technology, the right to use. What are some ways to explore all the options? Because I personally think that's really important. But while not getting into that pattern that Matthew, you chatted about, which is kind of that like, oh, there are so many different options, we have to evaluate every single one, and then it takes a month to evaluate every single of the 8 possible options. How do you get to a solution that is almost good enough, especially for that initial iteration, while not shutting down colleagues? I feel like I've been in spaces where people will have ideas, but because we've got a viable option, the others are kind of shut down. Like, oh, well, we've already got a viable solution, so we're not going to evaluate any others. I think both have their negatives. I'm kind of interested to hear your perspective, Jon, on ways in which you've navigated that, you've found ways that have made that a successful collaboration, especially when there's multiple engineers coming up with different options. Just interested to hear your point of view there.
So it depends on time pressure a bit. But, you know, best case scenario is you have time and you're not looking at options that take huge amounts to at least prove out. actually backing up a little bit. The first thing I'll do is I'll ask, why won't this work? Not from a negative standpoint, but, is it going to fulfill all of the requirements that we have? Because, you might be like, yeah, this is going to be super fast for reads. Great. We're going to go and do it. But you're not thinking about the right aspect. And if right aspects are important and the rights would be really hard, then that's something you need to look at first. So first, looking at holistically, do all the solutions check all the boxes, or is there a clear, nope, this will make life really bad? Once you're beyond that, if you've got the time, a battle of code. Let's see what it'll do. Developer A has this idea, developer B has this idea, go. It'll be fun. We can prove it out and learn through doing that, and see how it goes. Now, that oftentimes isn't something that you have time for. So then it does come down to, just having that pros and cons discussion of, option A will give us this, option B will give us this. And hopefully that results in a clear, this is the one that makes the most sense. But sometimes you do just need a decider as well. Even if it's an arbitrary flip of the coin with two solutions appearing equal, picking one and going for it. And there it helps if, all your engineers understand that what they're developing, well, they should have pride in it for their personal stuff. They're not developing it for themselves. You're working for the company. It's ultimately the company's product. So a little bit of healthy detachment from the work and understanding that it is a product and not a reflection of you as an individual. Even if it doesn't go your way, it goes a long ways.
Yeah, this is tough. I was thinking about this whole time while you're talking, and like you're right. I mean, there's no right way to do this, and sometimes you do just need a decider. I've felt, and this is probably because like my time at Oxide and probably being around Chris for too long now, my stance on writing has changed. Like I always found writing to be a great way to get your thoughts on paper, and writing is thinking, right? But it's also like committing to memory in a sense, or committing to recording of information, right? And I know that sounds silly. It's like, of course, writing is recording information, but it's so important in these scenarios because when you have multiple ways to go in a project, multiple solutions, multiple implementations, whatever it is, and you're unsure of what to take, you can just write down like why, like what it is you want to do about one scenario, write down why you want to choose that one, and then go for it. And then like when you do get down the road enough where you're like, actually, this is wrong, you can come back to what you've written, update it with why it was wrong, and then go to the next one. You know what I mean? And I find that to be helpful because so many people don't do that. They just chart down a path and they're like, nope, this is wrong. And then you go down another path and you're like, yep, this is right. But you didn't spend any time writing down why for either one of them. And then the new engineers come along. You've since left the company because you're going somewhere else. And now these new engineers come in and are like, what's going on here? And then they repeat the same things that you just did because they didn't know you did them, right? They try a different approach that was already tried. They find the same lesson out. They're like, oh, actually, this doesn't work. Rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. So I just feel like writing really helps solidify what solutions you're taking and prevents like repeated work in the future. Or even enables repeated work in the future, but with a new perspective. Like, oh, Matt said we couldn't do this because of that. That is no longer a constraint. Let's revisit this,
That is actually a really good point and brings up something that I am bad about, which is documentation and writing those things down, because I can't count the number of times, or it might have even been something that I did 6 months ago and I'm looking back and going, why did we do it that way? There had to have been a reason. But if you've got that all in a journal and you've got it recorded somewhere, you can also look back when there's new problems and you can be like, all right, well, so these are mistakes that we've made in the past. Let's not repeat them. These are things that we've done similar. So long-winded way of saying 100% agree. And that's said as somebody who's terrible at doing that.
It's okay. I know we all are. We're all learning.
I love documentation.
Yeah.
I absolutely love documentation. I do think, and Jon will know this because he's on my team. By the way, Jon's on my team. Side note, Jon will know this, is I do think though it's sometimes difficult because I'll say, oh, we need to write this down. Can we please write like a pros and cons? Can we do all this? And then the inevitable trade-off as we talked about at the beginning, is, okay, Angelica, I need a week to do this. I could either spend a week documenting it, or I could do the thing in a week. And inevitably, and this is me putting my hands up, ultimately it's usually like, let's just do the thing. And then we'll come back to documentation later. Sometimes we do, which I think is wonderful. But I think sometimes, and this is a problem in general, that I'm personally am trying to get better at on our team, but I do think it is a problem, is people pushing off that documentation step and saying, oh, well, we will do it. Let's get a ticket on the board if you use Jira. Or like write it down as something we'll do, or we'll try and update as we go, especially with like architectural diagrams. But more often than not, it's something that does need to be explicitly prioritized, because I do think it's hard in the day-to-day to remember sometimes. If you're like one ticket away from launching a product versus sitting down for a couple hours and writing down why you wanted to launch that product or why you implemented it someday, I think it's hard. It's that continual trade-off. That I think can be challenging at times. But I agree. I think I've really, really appreciated when people have documented things for me. And I have seen the benefit of, especially now I've been on my team for about 7 years full-time, like 9 years if you include part-time. So a while, and someone will bring something up and say, oh, why did we do this? Like, when did we do this thing? And I can just go into find the Google Doc and be like, hey, go, this is why. So let's not rehash this. So ultimately it does save you time in the long run.
But I'd also argue there's ways that you can do documentation where it's part of the product, right? So when you're talking about like code oddities, like your code is like, it is a form of prose itself. So you can structure code in a way that is to an extent self-documenting. Don't be afraid to put in comments. This is why we did this crazy thing. Stuff like API documentation, whatnot. If you can put that in with the project when you're working on it, then it's not a follow-up thing. Any task that changes the API, part of that task is updating the Swagger docs that live with the code. So getting as many things into the code base as possible, so it's right there and not a separate entity, goes a long ways. And another thing that I've always thought that would be really useful, even for internal tools, is good end user documentation. Writing out that this is how the end user will use this. Now, I will say that really hasn't happened any places that I've worked at, but it's a dream, because that's also something that's really useful for like regressions. When you're like, well, we don't. There's so often you go in and you're like, I don't know what the behavior of this is supposed to be because the code looks wrong, but it's doing a thing. So if you can have that document that says, the user should go in here and check these boxes and this is the output, bang, you're gold. You can work off of that.
Yeah, this is an interesting topic because I like when my documentation lives in code too. So it's like, it tries to stay up to date with the code because it's there. But then like each programming language has its own way of writing documentation for its specific, generation tool. And sometimes those worlds have tensions, right? Where if you're writing, like in the case of OpenAPI, like sure, that's more end user facing, but we use OpenAPI to generate SDKs most times, and then it pulls those those descriptions or whatever from the endpoints or from the objects into the code. And like I was writing a Packer plugin for Oxide, and it takes the documentation for the types and generates like a markdown for it. And that's what you're supposed to put in front of your end users. And I'm like, wait a minute. The way I would normally write documentation for like my types in a programming language is different than how I'm doing it here for Packer, because this is meant to be end user facing. And normally when I write those comments, it's for like engineers, right? For developers. And I was like, whoa, I was at odds, essentially, was what I'm trying to say, is I wanted to write engineering focused documentation, but my audience wasn't engineers at that point, it was end users. So I was like, what do I do here? And I really had to take a step back and be like, do I separate these concerns, or do I just lean in and be like, you know what, I'm going to write strictly end user documentation? And it was difficult at first to really be like, how do I make this so it's beneficial for the users and for me? And I ended up leaning, treating it as all end user documentation. But then I wrote documentation about that saying, hey, we don't do that here, right? The meme, right? We don't do that here. Yeah. I wrote that here saying, if you expected to write Go comments, we're not doing that in this project, and here's why.
It's also a skill in itself. I think the last place I worked that actually had technical writers was IBM, which, IBM, go figure, they kind of need it. But it is its own discipline.
So we've talked a little bit about, what's the right problem? How do we think about making sure we are actually solving the right one? Getting clarity on our users. Who are they? What are their true needs? Not what they think they need and what they say they need, because often those are not the same thing. And then a little bit about how to kind of take that first step, that first iteration, and try and decide, okay, this is the high level solution we're going to pursue. I want to now bring us to crafting your solution, like getting a little bit into, as you're crafting your solution, are there things you could be doing to ensure it's scalable? It's something that, or at least part of it, is able to be brought forward and built upon for the future. Are there certain, kind of as you talked about, Jon, already a little bit, those non-negotiables, those things you absolutely have to think deeply about at the beginning because it'll be hard to change, versus things that are a little bit more fluid? What are some things that you should be cognizant of as you're designing your first iteration solution to make sure that it's not going to be I build an MVP, this can't scale, we have to build something else entirely for the next iteration?
Yep. So really, for me, the starting point there is encapsulation. And this is something that can apply at a bunch of different levels, whether you're talking like in code, in packages, properly encapsulating things and having things that do everything should have a single responsibility. But it's also like Amanda brought, when you look at something, you might say, all right, we're in a big multi-service world with a bunch of different microservices all doing different things. Each of those microservices should encapsulate something. So it might be like, well, we've got a thing that sends emails. So that's its domain. If it involves sending emails, we're going to go to this one thing. But then when you look at that under the hood and you start zooming in, well, there's a bunch of different things that go for sending emails. So that one system should then be broken down into different packages, which are, a bunch of different files doing different things, but you might have a package for SMTP and a package for POP or whatever. And then once you dive into those, you're going to have different classes or structs or whatever, using whatever paradigm you have that encapsulates smaller sections of logic. And a big one is data. So encapsulating data. So only one thing should be reading and writing to a specific data store. It's something you kind of take for granted sometimes in microservice worlds where we're like, we don't have two systems reaching into the same database. But focusing on that and understanding why, it's, all right, well, our data needs might change. So if all the different things are reaching into this one underlying store, it makes it really inflexible, and growing it and changing it can cause ripple effects. So really limiting things to doing just a single thing actually makes them more useful than making things that do many things. So things that do many things might seem great at the moment because, it does a lot, but then it becomes too broad, and it might also become too hyper-focused for its original use case that it becomes unusable in other cases.
So when designing those, you talked about kind of keeping the single responsibility principle in mind, but also not making it too specific so that it's not extensible. I kind of want to dig into that a little bit, just because that feels like a balance. It feels like you want to make it do a very specific thing, but not too specific. And you want it to be broad enough to be extensible and flexible, but not so broad and flexible and extensible that it's just a jumble of random shenanigans and we're not following that single responsibility principle. Because you maybe dig into that a little bit.
Well, and so this is where, for me, it becomes more of an art than a science. And because there are generally no correct answers, and actually leaning into, this is actually a creative expression in its own way. And yeah, so one, identifying things that are hard to change. So data, contracts, those are going to be very difficult to change. So you need to be a little bit more firm set on those. And you've got a lot more leeway when it comes to code and packages, because those are things that can be changed under the hood without hopefully impacting other users. But yeah, so basically, I'd look at it as the more simple of a function you have, the more reusable it is. So the less that it's doing means it's more likely to be able to be composed with other things to make interesting, fun things happen, versus things that do more on their own. They become more hyper-focused at one thing and become less reusable. And again, there's no right or wrong answer. It kind of becomes an art.
It is an art, and it's like, it's interesting because, again, the urgency and rigor sort of deal kind of comes into play here, right? And there's like that balance you have to get to. But as engineers, I find engineers generally try to go too far in the reusable side, where it's like, I have to make everything so modular, and like we're all going to call the same library and it's gonna be great. And it's like, what you're really doing is you're accidentally coupling parts of your software that maybe shouldn't have been coupled, but you didn't spend time thinking about it. So you've kind of, hurt yourself a bit there. And I was thinking about this when I was writing the Packer plugin for Oxide the other day. And I was like, okay, I need to confirm that an instance is stopped before I do like extra, before I do more things, before I take the next step. And I can like extract that into a function that says like ensure instance stopped or whatever. But the way that that function's would be in a couple different contexts. So really, if I did that, I would have been coupling these different steps together behind this function that I've abstracted because, repetition is bad, right? Because some arbitrary rule saying like, don't repeat yourself, like, oh my God. And that sort of accidental coupling is something that I encourage people to push back against, because you should be taking a step back and thinking of like, what is my unit here, right? Like, what is the thing? What is the solution or the single responsibility that I'm doing here? Like you were saying, right? Keep things single responsibility. And if you can like clearly define that single responsibility, you'll be able to see like, oh, wait a minute. If I do abstract this out, no longer does this have like its own kind of scope of responsibility. I've coupled these two things together. And I just think that that's an important thing for people that are listening to like think about in their own code. Don't just chase something because it's the better way, air quotes, to do it.
Yeah, and I would almost add like reusability should be something that happens as a side effect of good development rather than your intent. You should never be going and saying like, I'm going to do this thing that'll be reusable. But if you do it right, then you'll discover, oh wait, I can reuse this thing. And actually for me, a really good tool for this is unit tests. So, if you're writing unit tests and you're discovering that, this thing is a pain to test because I'm testing 12 different things and it's there's a bunch of different assertions each test is having to make. Well, maybe that's a sign that you've got more than one thing that it's doing. So using unit tests not only as a tool to assert that your code does what it was, but as like an aid for keeping that, is this thing doing too much at once? So like it'll also improve your code that way.
So we've mentioned this a couple times, and the importance of thinking through kind of your contracts, because they're going to be hard to change. And they're one of those things where, especially if you have many different clients, people, utilizing your APIs and interacting with your services, if you want to make a change, you might need to interact with 10, 20, 30, 50, however many different external teams who are dependent on your implementation. And really, it's going to be really painful if you have to try and change it. I know previously we've talked about this, and I think it would be relevant in this forum to talk a little bit about kind of like, how do you think about creating implementation agnostic contracts? Because I think that's a really important thing to think through, because I think it demonstrates for me, spoiler alert, this is my view, that although you need to think about your contracts very carefully and seriously, that doesn't mean you shouldn't be thinking about flexibility. And that doesn't mean you shouldn't be thinking about that, going back to what this whole episode is about, that future, acknowledging that change is inevitable and you're never going to have something that's never ever going to change ever. So maybe you could spend a beat, Jon, talking a little bit about how you think about that kind of implementation of agnostic contracts.
Yep. So one of the big things that helps for me is thinking not so much in the sense of features, but in capabilities. So when we want to build a feature, well, we don't just build a feature, we build capabilities that can.
Yeah, nobody wants food from a nasty kitchen. How far can we stretch this this metaphor here?
Although a nasty truck might actually have really good food.
That's true. Yeah, you get a nice little dive truck and you can get some really good food from there. Yeah, you're not wrong. Well, I know you were mentioning, or I think Angelica was mentioning a rename of Teams, Memo, Helix, or that stuff. I know we wanted to dive into a little bit of that case study. I think now would be a good time as ever. Angelica, would you like to take us to the promised land?
Yeah, sure. The promised land. The promised land of Memo, which, to completely contradict what I've just said, does Memo tell you what it does? No. Anyway, point being, a number of years ago, and I'm sure Jon will add plenty of additional context, but the TLDR is we built this messaging platform to send emails. Originally raw HTML, and then we iterated it, integrated it with an internal article creation, so content creation tool. So then we could send more kind of design heavy emails. Push then came along, push notifications. Our team took over that, and to put it in the most accurate way, it might not be the most delicate, we just shoved push into an email platform, and we're like, okay, it kind of works, like let's just do that. But we did not build for the future. We just kept shoving stuff in, trying to put a square peg in a round hole and trying to make it work, to the point where we could not handle the load of all of the emails and all the pushes that we needed to send. It was sending really slow. And with the New York Times, like, breaking news is really important. The whole point is that we get information to people quickly in a timely fashion. So we got to a breaking point where we needed to either invest in making Helix, which was the name of our old platform, better, or build an entirely new platform from scratch called Memo. Of course, taking learnings from the old platform, but a true like greenfield rewrite. And spoiler alert, we ended up building Memo, the completely fresh new platform. But that was a point where we had to build for the future, because part of the reason that we got investment from our leadership group to spend what was, I think it was maybe 2 years, 3 years, 2 years, I can't remember, a long time, not delivering really any, or at least minimal business value from leadership was, hey, we're going to build this platform. It's going to be resilient. We're going to scale it. It's going to be great for the future. And we won't have to do a big greenfield rewrite again. In order for that to be true, we had to really build for the future and try our best to make sure that we were making the right decisions, and the kind of decisions that we didn't make with Helix, to make sure we weren't going to put ourselves in this kind of confuddlement, this place where nothing worked again, which was the case with Helix. So Jon,
Yep.
Maybe you can set us up from the technical perspective and how you thought about that, and how Jon was our fearless leader on that project. So how he helped us eventually be very, very successful. And I'm so happy. And Memo is actually I have a t-shirt that says Memo is the new hotness that I wore this morning.
So yeah, and this is one where I'll dive in, and I will say that, everybody wants to do a greenfield rewrite when they're doing things, because it is easier to build new and whatnot, but it is almost never the right option. And this is a case where we were kind of forced into it. So the old Helix system, oh, there is the Memo is the new hotness shirt. I love it. I think I've still got mine floating around somewhere too. But Helix would be what I call a distributed monolith. It was a bunch of microservices, but none of them operated on their own. They all worked together to do a very specific thing, and the shape of the systems was kind of determined by the problem that it was being solved, because it's basically, if you think about like sending out an email like the morning, or a push notification, it's basically a big fan out operation. And so servers were set up at the different fan out points, which got the job done. but they all also, there was no encapsulation. So there was one data store that all the different things read from. And when we started experiencing the issues causing performance, it was with the data store. And it turned out we were taking advantage of a bug in a cloud provider that enabled us to get mad performance for stupid cheap. And they fixed that bug. So all the things we're talking to that one data point, there you go. Life's not going to be fun. We got to either have a new data store and migrate everything to it, or just start from the scratch. So when we did the memo migration, we actually were kind of fortunate where we knew the problem that to be solved, right? We didn't have to do a bunch of discovery because it was do the same thing that we used to be doing, but actually do it successful or do it in a way that performs. So we kind of looked at, and actually, if you were to draw the two new systems out, there's going to be roughly the same number of boxes in each one, but how they connect is very different. And there's a lot more services now that don't know about the entire flow. So like now we've got stuff where, if you want to send an email to a user, there's a thing that'll do that. You want to pull audience information, there's a thing that'll do that. It knows nothing about the thing that's going to be sending the email, and the email things knows nothing about it. But then there's a glue service that kind of encapsulate the more business prospect, where it knows that, to send the morning, I need to go out and find people who are subscribed to the morning and get them back and then send them out to dispatch the emails, versus, the old, what I call distributed monolith approach, where all the things knew the entire flow. Does that kind of capture what you're after there, Angelica, or is that...
Yes, no, for sure. So it was less about, if I'm making sure I hear you correctly, it was less about the number of services and simplifying in terms of numbers of services and number of interactions, and more about making sure that the relationships between those pieces of infrastructure were as simple and as streamlined as possible. And you touched on something I think worth double tapping on, which was did not require knowledge of the other pieces, other than the ones that were absolutely essential.
Yep, and that's where it's tying into, make the thing more powerful by making it dumber, because it does just one thing, but that means it's likely to be able to use, hey, there's a billing email that needs to go out. Well, we've got a thing that can do that now outside of the scope of like sending the morning. Another thing that we touched on earlier was, the idea of don't repeat yourself. So that's kind of why the push stuff got slammed into the email thing, because it's a very similar pattern, right? So we don't want to repeat all those different architectural points. And I'd say, well, that's kind of the naive approach, because if you look at it, yes, it's a repeated pattern, but it's not duplicate knowledge. Push scales very differently than email, push notifications, take your pick of the horrible things that are going on today. We want to get that out as soon as possible. That's got a different scaling need than like getting an email out where it's a more asynchronous kind of thing. So separating that out, yes, we duplicated a bunch of code for some types of things and eventually refactored some of those things into libraries, but I don't mind copying and pasting a pattern because the underlying knowledge is different. I'm not duplicating that knowledge. And now we've got a separate system for push that can scale entirely independently of email and evolve independently of email, because it is a different thing doing different knowledge, even though it looks similar.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at before when I was talking about the accidental coupling, right? Or where you actively thought about that and you were like, I don't really mind the copy pasting. It's fine, because they're separate concerns and they can be separate and they need to scale separately. And then eventually, you refactor that into libraries. And I think that's where people, I think they get tripped up, right? Not just, I don't want to revisit the accidental coupling thing again, but they get tripped up with looking at a problem or looking at implementation and trying to just follow the idioms that everyone else is following, instead of just making the right decision for your use case and the data you have, right? Emails don't need to be sent at the same rate as push notifications. They don't need to be sent at the same rate as like billing invoices, or, Like all of these things have separate concerns. and they all need to like send an email to the user, or they need to notify the user, but the way they do it and the scale that they're operating at are completely different. And if you don't know that, how are you building the right thing at all? You know what I mean? If you're going to approach this, maybe a more naive engineer would approach this and be like, I'm going to build the notifier services to end all notifier services, and it can scale to 1 million, and it can just do this thing, and it's amazing. Oh my God, never goes. It's like, great, but that's not your use case. That's not your the whole domain driven design principle that people like to spit out. You're not thinking in the domain that you're operating in. That's not how your users are using the app. That's not where your app is even, like the domain your app's even in. What are you doing? Are you just trying to pass a Google interview? That's what it sounds like you're doing.
Yep. Nope, 100%. Actually, though, this is an area where I actually think AI development tools can be really helpful because, like, there's a bunch of scaffolding, and that is something I trust like Cursor to do, is that initial scaffolding. I don't trust Cursor as far as I can throw it for much anything else, and I know it's going to need to be looked through there, but when I'm repeating something else, I can say, hey, give me a copy of this that's tweaked for that. It can be a good time saver.
I totally agree. That boilerplate or that sort of repeatable code, AI is great for that. Or especially when you have established patterns in your own code and you're like, hey, this is the general flow of how I notify. I verify the email address, and then I got the notification, and then I draft, whatever steps you take. This is my flow, and I need to apply it to this context. Like, do it. You know what I mean? And it does a pretty good job of that. And then you just come over and do the last 20% of the work or whatever. And I think that's a good use of AI, and one that I would generally agree with, especially someone who I'm spending a lot of my time making plugins and integrations for Oxide. And a lot of things, like with plugins, there's generally some interface you have to implement. And, so there's methods that you have to like implement. And then if you need to do that n number of times. So a lot of it is going to be like copy pasting the structure and then filling it out differently for whatever you're doing. And it's like, AI is great at that. You know what I mean? Like, just do that, and I'll come fill it up when you mess up because you don't know things. You don't actually know things. You're making up things that don't exist, but that's fine. I can fix that part for you. Does that mean you are in on the Cursor train? Is that what I hear?
I'm sort of in on it. So part of the problem is that I have been on IntelliJ for probably 18, 19 years, to the point I actually have the legacy key binding still. And like, if you put a modern IntelliJ in front of me with a new key map, I'm like, I don't know what I'm doing. Yeah. So like, switching IDEs is a big deal, and it actually impacts my productivity massively. So I lose a lot. So when I am using Cursor, usually I have Cursor and IntelliJ open, and I'll tell Cursor to do a thing and then go over to IntelliJ to check out what it did.
Gotcha. Speaking of us, like the sharpening knives analogy we were using before, that there should always be time to sharpen our knives and whatever. I felt similarly, not with the AI editor stuff, but when I switched my keyboard to a split keyboard, I couldn't type to save my life. Like, I'm a pretty consistent, like anywhere between 80 to 110, 120 words per minute, depending on what I'm typing. I'm pretty consistent in that typing speed. I dropped to like 20. You know what I mean? I dropped so bad that, my wife could type faster than me. She is not a good typist, right? From that perspective. But I felt so unproductive, and it was horrible. And it just really, I put the keyboard aside and went back to my old keyboard for a little bit. And I was just like, not embarrassed because nobody's watching me, but I was just like, are people going to find out that I am taking like 5 minutes to reply to a simple Slack message? Like, am I going to be found out right now? And it does put a burden on you when you're switching tools or switching IDEs or whatever it is. But there is benefit to the other side if you stick with it too, depending on what it is you're doing. And I think that's another thing in this ship world that we live in, is we're not always given that time to really just relearn something or to learn something new. And I think that's a problem when you're trying to build for the future, because the future is constantly in motion and changing, right? Like, the future is technically now, if you think about it, right? We're like literally constantly in motion and we're going into the future. And that means if you're not adjusting, what's going to happen? You know, if your code's not adjusting, if you're not adjusting, like that means the people who have the time to adjust because they don't have the same responsibilities you do, right? They're just sitting at home living with their parents, grinding LeetCode code all day. Those people can leapfrog, you know, and that's a scary thing. So when we say building for the future here in this episode, it's not just your code, it's you too, right? You do have to build yourself for the future. And it's a scary and difficult thing to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Am I becoming like Chris? I'm going on monologues now. Damn it. No.
To put a car analogy on it, because I love car analogies, you got to know when to pit. You're going to have to do it at some point. So you can't just stay out forever, because if you do, it's going to get to the point where you're in the wall. So knowing when to pull in and get that recharge in and learn new tools.
That's why you just run on hard tires forever. Okay.
There you go.
Yeah. Mandatory tire change? Where? Who? I don't change. Oh, it's funny. No, you're totally right.
So speaking of like this, thinking about the future, making sure that you're using technology that is going to help you build towards the future. We mentioned AI. I kind of understand, how do you think about using new technologies that come into the industry? Like things that you might be shiny and new and exciting, new technologies, new frameworks, but because you're trying to build for the future, how do you evaluate whether this is something that's just shiny and new and fun versus something that's actually going to consistently do the job you need it to do? Because I think that's pretty hard, certainly as I'm thinking about these things.
So approach with caution. Like one is like if there's something out that's a beta something and we think it might be really, really applicable for us, maybe we'll find a low risk area where we can bring it in and try it out. But there's no way I'm going to use a beta technology, to power the homepage where millions of people are seeing it every day. You've got to have a really clear advantage to take the risk on something like that. Keeping up to date on things, that's actually probably one of the hardest things out there. And that's where I actually kind of farm that out to the youngins that are coming in, because they're much better about finding new stuff. And this is where it's really important to listen to, even your junior engineers have good ideas, and you're probably going to get more fresh ideas from them and enabling them, giving them a pathway to present these types of new ideas and bubble them up for some of us older and crustier folks who might not be spending, 8 hours a day after work in the tech because, well, we're old and gray. Embracing the younger generation is huge, I think.
Yeah, I think that a mistake people make is both ways, though. Both ways. Not just, the more experienced hearing and embracing the less experienced and new people, but vice versa. Because I've seen people where it's just like you're re-implementing the same thing again and again, thinking that you're doing it for the first time, and you're not. You're like you're the 500th person that wants to rebuild containers, but they've been around for decades. Like, it's not new, it's not hip. You should take those on so you can learn and whatever and get a new perspective. You should take that on, but don't think that like it's never been solved or thought about before either, right? There's things to be learned on both sides, but I don't have the time or really the care that I once did when I was younger, right? Where I'm like, where I was the one living with my parents with unlimited time and I could just stay on the computer all night. I don't have that anymore, right? I have responsibilities and other things to do. And it is nice to kind of let the other people trip over little things for a little bit, and then you kind of just digest it afterwards. Like, oh, you spent a weekend learning Haskell? Great, tell me, please. And just sit there like, give me the 5-minute summary, thanks.
Give me the TLDR.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to bring us back. We've talked about how do you even decide what's going on, what's the solution, what's the problem. We've talked a little bit about how to keep building for the future in mind as we're building. How do you think about building for the future and building for the future you, perhaps when on call, post-launch?
So Actually, so for being me on call, like this is one where I think it really helps having actually had some time outside of just development and like back when system administrators were a thing, being a system admin and being familiar with networking and whatnot, and developing sympathy for the architecture itself and not just the code, and understanding like the network is unreliable AF and it's also slow AF. So getting outside of the code and having more of a whole picture of the entire ecosystem is really, really helpful there. So if you don't have your engineers on call, put them on call for a little while. They might throw a fit, but they'll come out of it better engineers, and it'll be good for their careers. This is something you do want to balance with, work life, and you can't have people on call 24/7. But I would encourage engineers to spend time, if they don't do production support, spend time with the people that do production support and see what their life's like. And then I'll swing back to like my cure-all for building for the future can come down to one word, and encapsulation, and just embracing it and making sure things are doing as little as possible and know as little as possible, because that also makes them easier to troubleshoot.
Is there something to be said about surfacing errors in a way that is going to be understandable and comprehensible by people outside of your current team, i.e. the current team, because hopefully everyone's going to be on the team forever for like 20 years. It's going to be great. We're all going to grow all together. But if people leave the team, which they never will, is how much do you think it makes sense to lean into writing error messages, thinking about monitoring, reporting, etc., in a way that if someone came in tomorrow with no context, they would be able to understand it?
So there's a couple of different approaches there. So like if you're talking for end users, as little detail as possible. This isn't because we don't like end users. It's because we don't want to confuse them, and we also don't want to build in security risks. Like you can never just bubble up an error message straight from a thing to the end user, whether it's an API or a front end. If it's a benevolent user, they're going to see it and not understand. But if it's an evil user, that's leaking information about how your stuff is done, and gives more potential attack vectors and whatnot. So exposing errors out, don't just expose like a correlation ID, something that you've got associated with your logs and whatnot, that they can say, hey, I got error, blah, blah, blah. What does it mean? Now, the exception to that is if it's, an error message or an error that the user might trust. So like, if you're receiving 503s from something, it's overloaded. That might be a case where you say, hey, things are under heavy load right now. Please try again later. Let them self-service, or, this field is wrong. Correct it. That sort of thing, by all means, clear, precise information. But technical errors, don't bubble it up to the users. Now, as far as your team goes, though, like with alerts, one of the best things that you can do, like if you're using a Datadog and you've got APM going, any alert goes off, have it have a link to APM for the thing that's going on so that they can see the errors right then and there. You don't have APM, but you've got some sort of, whether it's Splunk, Sumo Logic or something, include those messages or links to relevant things in your alerts. And there you're going to want to have as much detail as possible. As well as, if this is stuff that we expect that might be happening, include that in those. That kind of get what you're after?
Yeah, we're looking for all the tips and tricks.
I agree with the don't just bubble up errors to your end users without letting them pass through some sort of handler, right? That whatever handler that's going to convert it, sanitize it. And I don't mean sanitize like, redaction. I mean like understand semantically what the error meant and tell the user in a different way without leaking more critical information. I agree with that. A lot of things that we do at work, there's like a concept of an internal and external error, which is nice. Some just, wrap it and log the error internally and then like send a generic error to the user. And I think those are helpful. The only time I'm ever in favor of logging the underlying error back to the user or whatever is if you actually know what was the problem and you can tell the user how to explicitly fix it. Like, hey, you provided a username but no password. You know what I mean? Like, or something like that, where it's just like, you did this. Here's how here's what you should have done. I'm okay with that because then you're just helping the user self-service a little bit and you can save some like support tickets or whatever. And then as far as like APM and tracing and all that, if you're not using it, like this is where I'm going to put my charity majors hat on a little bit. If you're not using APM and tracing and instrumentation and all of this in development, how are you going to use it in production? You know, like honestly, if you're not building applications that are instrumented for tracing locally and using that to develop and debug your application, what makes you think you're going to do that in production? You know, you're not going to do that in production at all. And it's going to be a worse experience for everybody.
So that actually reminds me. So we do a lot of serverless development. And one byproduct of that is, running it locally, we don't even bother with. Yes, there's like the cloud stack or whatever where you theoretically could, but we've embraced using Terraform and workspaces. So, when an engineer wants to test things, they're not running it locally unless it's a unit test. They're actually pushing their stuff up to the cloud and running it there. We built things that allow them to do so easily, but we've noticed that observability is now just a first-class citizen because that's how engineers are having to figure out what's going on through development. So when it goes to prod, you can see what's going on because they had to have it there for development. And that makes me kind of want to reevaluate, like if I were to go back to doing more traditional development, maybe running locally isn't a good thing.
Yeah, that depends on how you do it. I mean, I don't mind running locally, but you're totally right that a lot of the tooling that you're going to use to debug in production may not even be there, right? Because it does kind of suck where you have like, and I will never say this vendor's name, so I'm going to switch. You have like Honeycomb in production. I'm not going to say the other vendor, so I'm going to say Honeycomb instead. Love Honeycomb. You have like Honeycomb in production, right? For example, and like you have just a rich data there. You have dashboards, you have queries, you have like bubble up their feed. You have all their cool features there in production. You're using that, and then you're locally developing, and then you can't afford Honeycomb for like local development, not because it's expensive or whatever, but because like your budget, you just couldn't do it. Mm-hmm. That sucks where you have that disconnect where you're like, you have the tool you need and want in one environment, but then your local environment, you're stuck with like Jaeger and some other stuff. Not that they're not good, but they're not what you're using in production. So there's a disconnect. That's a really miserable place to be. And it doesn't incentivize people to develop with tracing and such, because I've used tracing to develop and I've just logged it to standard out. And it was miserable. I was just like, here's my standard out exporter. I got tracing. And it's like, okay, great. What am I going to do with this?
So we're coming somewhat to the end of our discussion, but I want to make sure, because we have talked about a lot of different things. Is there anything else, either Matt or Jon, that you think it's worth us kind of taking that additional beat on to go slightly deeper, or anything that you haven't mentioned that you want to dig into?
I think the only thing that comes to mind, codify all the things. Even in development, if you're clicking buttons in a console to create resources, you will pay for it down the line. So whether it's Terraform, CloudFormation, Puppet, Ansible, whatever you're using, just find a tool to codify all the things that you can, and make it part of your normal development flow.
Yeah. My advice to people like wanting to write maintainable code for the future is a simple one. Don't be afraid to change things. I think we as this industry is so annoyingly funny and annoying. It's like irritating sometimes, where I was in a diner the other day eating breakfast or whatever, and I was just staring, I was just observing the general diner of how they operate and what they're doing. And I've been to this diner many years, so I know what they're doing. And it's just funny how when you map some of the concepts from software to like the real world, it makes no sense anymore, right? Like in the real world, this diner has made breaking changes all the time. It's created new menu items. It's shuffled its chairs around. It's got new people that work there. It's moved other equipment around. It's decorated, right? It's made changes that like are different. It's not the same where you came back there. Some of them are breaking, some of them are not. Like a menu change could be a breaking change if you can only eat one thing on the menu or whatever and it's no longer there. That could be a breaking change. But they do it. And like users adapt to that on the fly. And then in software, where software is so cheap to produce / malleable, where it can be changed so easily, we're just like, scary. Not going to make that breaking change there. Sorry. Oh, I typoed os.create. It's going to stay in there forever. HTTP refer header. It's typoed refer. Stay in there forever. It's like, why are we doing this to ourselves? So I just don't be afraid to change things is my advice, because if you're changing it in the name of making it more clear for future people, it'll catch up and be better over the time. Yeah, there's gonna be a little like hiccup there where it kind of feels a little annoying, but it's gonna be better in the long term, in my opinion. Don't be afraid.
Agreed. Change that stuff.
Change it. You don't keep the same pair of underwear on all day, do you? Or all week or all month, do you? No, you change it.
I was gonna be like, geez, all right.
Sorry, I said all day at first, and then I was just like, it's like, hold up, I have to stretch my margins.
We all have different cleanly standards.
Actually, I'm due for my underwear change right now. You can't bring me on a podcast.
I respect your decisions as it pertains to your undergarments. Okay. On that wonderful note, we're going to turn over to talking a little bit about our unpopular opinions. As a reminder, but I feel like we're all old hats at this point because, Jon, you've done this before. Unpopular opinion doesn't have to be to do with tech. Doesn't need to be to do with anything we've talked about on this episode. It can be. It can be a completely random opinion. The only rule is that you need to think that it's going to be unpopular with our listeners or with your fellow hosts on this podcast. So, Jon, do you have one ready to go? Do you want to start?
I do. So this is more, it's a technology-based one.
Great.
And I know I'm not alone in it, but I'm guessing it'll be probably unpopular with at least some people, but I think AI is largely just a fad.
Okay. Say more.
So I do think that it is actually, there are lots of things coming out of AI that are useful tools. But I think that a large amount of the hype about it is just going to kind of fizzle out. And that we'll see it take a much smaller seat at the table in the future once the dust is leveled out and once a bunch of people have spent a whole lot of money on it and thrown a bunch of money away too.
So you think that, just to clarify, you feel like the hype and the talk around it will phase, or the use of it? Because I feel like those are two different things. And
the use. It's not going away. It is something that will remain around, but it's not going to be like, and it will change how we work with stuff, but it's not going to be this fundamental change where like there's not engineers anymore or companies are X times more profitable because of it. It's just going to make some people a bit more efficient. But like right now we live in a world where people use AI to craft wonderfully sounding emails, that are long and flowing and whatever, that are then condensed down to TLDRs by AI on the other side. That seems kind of pointless. It's something that will disappear.
Okay.
I mean, I'm with you.
I feel
on this
about
one.
that. You're with him?
I'm with him. I've said so many unpopular things on this podcast. I'm the contrarian here. No, I was having a barbecue this weekend or whatever. We were chilling. Had a couple friends, family over, and we were talking about this topic exactly, about AI and how we feel like and these are also software people. We feel similarly how the at least the hype cycle is over. I think we're in a period of waning now with AI. And if this next iteration of models or functionality can't show like things that are beyond generative AI capabilities that we've already seen, I think that'll just either even further accelerate the waning aspect of it. Not that like AI won't be useful in some regard, but I don't think it's gonna be the life-changing thing people are after. We're already kind of moving away from the AI editors. We're in this agent mode right now, and we've kind of shifted a few times already. Chat bots, editors, AI agents. I think it's still relatively a solution in search of a problem in so many ways. And I don't know. I think we are gonna wane more, in my opinion.
I feel like so many people don't know how to use it yet, though. So I feel like maybe the wane will come, but I just don't think it's going to come anytime soon because so many people are like just discovering these things, especially outside of our industry. Like I feel like our industry, like the tech industry, software engineering, we're at the forefront in a lot of ways. Like we're jumping into ChatGPT, we're jumping into Gemini, Cursor, but there's a whole broader spectrum of people who are like, I talked to someone who works in a beauty salon. She does waxing the other day, and I mentioned like ChatGPT and like, because she was talking about how frustrating it is to write up her like client list of services and what she offers and et cetera, et cetera. And I said, like, have you thought about putting it through ChatGPT and seeing what it suggests? She's like, what's that? I ran her through it. She started using it, and she's like, oh my gosh, she texts me. She's like, oh my gosh, Angelica, like, this is so cool. This is so helpful. This is amazing. I'm going to talk to like the rest of the people in my salon and see if they can use it. This made my life so much easier. Like, I'm trying to work out how much of it is that it's going to wane because we were so at the forefront of experimenting with it and using it when there's so many other people who have no idea how to use it or don't think it's relevant to them, and then they're introduced to it and they're like, oh my gosh, this is so great. I don't know. I just think there's so much more potential for the capabilities we currently have being used in much more interesting, inventive ways.
So I think you're actually going to run into cost being a factor there. So like right now, ChatGPT can be free to use and whatnot because they're trying to drive up more users of it. But if you look at it, it's not cheap to run. So like if people actually have to start paying for it once, we're past that initial wane and people need to make money from it. And so, having ChatGPT redo my essay for me, but I've got to pay for it, maybe not. So.
Yeah. We're back to that cost-benefit conversation at the beginning of the episode.
What it comes down to me is that if it's so easy to switch between AI models, what's the benefit of each of them? You know what I mean? Like, if I can switch from Cursor to Claude Code to Codex to Gemini to whatever, or to Windsurf, if I can just switch to them tomorrow, right? Be like, today. It's like we're in the streaming services era of AI right now, where like they're all playing the same freaking movies and content, but yet I'm subscribed to which one am I going to be subscribed to, right? This month, actually, this one has just that one movie that I need, so I'll subscribe this month to this one because it has everything I need plus that one. Actually, now next month this one has that, and I'll subscribe there. We're in that sort of era with AI where people are like, yeah, I'm paying monthly for Cursor, but this month I'm actually Claude Code's winning this month. I'm going to do Claude Code this one. And if that's how easy it is to switch away from these things, where's the value? Right? Really, where's the value? Like, it's like I can just go get tacos anywhere at any restaurant. So tacos aren't the value, right? If I can go anywhere. So I don't know. It's to me, it's weird. I'd like to see it solidify a little bit more. I do think that we are definitely post hype bubble, and it cost like you said, John, it costs so much. I don't think people really understand how much it costs, both in like time, like, man hours, time, equipment, energy. It costs so much to train and run these models. It's not sustainable. At some point, these VCs are going to be like, hey, I'm not dumping another $10 million, $100 million into you. So we'll see.
Only time will tell. I think that was a good unpopular opinion. Only time will tell.
Yeah, exactly.
I feel like that was a good unpopular opinion. It got us chit-chatting, which is always a good sign of an unpopular opinion. Matt, am I even going to ask if you have one? You always have one.
I always have one. always.
At least one, if not 5.
Yeah, I keep a little queue. Today, my unpopular opinion will be that your typing speed matters more than you think it does. Or maybe I should say that in a way, your typing speed is very important and you should make your typing speed faster. That's my unpopular opinion.
What is the definition of fast? As someone who loves numbers and metrics, what is the SLA?
I would say you should type at least like 60 to 70 words per minute.
Okay.
Like that's like a bar, I guess.
As a software engineer or in general?
if you
as
are
human beings.
primarily interacting with the computer if you're spending a lot of time interacting with the computer, your typing speed should be like 60 plus.
Mm-hmm. What benefits come from speed?
I mean, granted, with AI, it's probably less important than it was, but when you're thinking and you're in the zone about something, it's nice to be able to like keep up with the speed of your own thought in a sense, right? If you're like writing code or whatever it is you're doing, or writing a blog post, you know, because how many times have you written something? You had like 3 thoughts in your head. You started to write one thought and you took too long to write the one thought, and then thoughts 2 and 3 kind of disappeared, right? You're like, what was I thinking about? So I think that sort of speed of being able to get what's in your brain down on paper or down on screen, whatever it is super important.
Yeah, I do think there's thresholds for that. Because like hunt and peck, you're gonna experience exactly what you're saying, where like you're not able to get your thoughts down. Although I can think of a lot of types of work with computers where typing speed doesn't matter, but another speed's gonna matter. So like if you're doing graphical design, like it might not matter if you can't type fast, but you got to be able to work with, you know, whatever crazy pads and whatnot you're doing to express your thoughts quickly.
So do we feel like you need to bring back, and I say it like I don't actually know, do they still do touch typing classes at school? I used to have a whole hour every day where they sat me in front of a computer and made me do touch typing, and like it would get faster and faster, so you had to like practice typing faster and faster, and it was like gamified where you were a frog and you had to get past the logs and you had to type the word on the log to jump to the log. Is this just me?
So you're making me feel old. That was not even an option when I was in school. There were like 3 computers in the library.
We didn't have typing class in my school either, or any of that stuff. So I had to learn. In college, I did the whole write programs on paper thing. For a while.
Okay.
Yeah, they did that. I don't know. It's interesting. Like I played some of those games where it helped me type a little bit better, but I didn't truly learn how to touch type. So I was still a hunt and peck for a while, even when I started my career. And then I learned to touch type where I could like, but I was still looking at the keys, but I was using, at least I was using all my fingers. So I guess it wasn't touch typing yet. It was just using my fingers. And then I was able to touch type where I can look at the screen and not look at my keyboard at all to type. And that was a game changer to me. I was just like, whoa, I could actually stay focused on the task I'm doing and type. And then ever since then, I have never bought a keyboard with letterings on it again.
I think that was the game changer. Not having to look at the keyboard when you type. I think that, I would agree, is huge, because you don't have to keep looking down and up and down and up. You can just focus on what you're doing and type, and you have to look down.
That was it for me. That was a huge game changer for me.
Speed. I'm now intrigued. I don't actually know how fast I type. I feel like I need to test it now. I'll see if I make your threshold, Matt.
I mean, listen, I think it's a worth it skill, you know? You should be able to type
it's also
fast,
fun.
especially if that's what you're going to do, like for a living, right? If you're constantly in and out of conversations and coding or whatever, if you're just using the computer, you should be able to type fast, because that's a good skill.
I just think it's really fun. Maybe this is just me, and maybe I'm giving this away. Like, I feel like it's really invigorating when you type really fast. Like, you feel really cool.
Oh, hell
like,
yeah.
You're like, ooh.
I mean, but that's something to it, right? That feeling of accomplishment, and you feel cool. That is a good mental health.
So I actually learned to type on a typewriter from my mother. But that sound that when you get the mechanical and the head whirring and whacking the paper, where you get that really satisfying ding at the end and then it rushing back.
I have also used a typewriter, so
I have never used a typewriter.
I went to a museum and they let you type on the typewriter. It was wonderful. I will also say my grandma has a typewriter because she used to be a receptionist, and she wrote all her notes, her meeting notes on a typewriter. And it is so fun. That ding, ding, ding.
What's really fun is if you can get your hands on the old ones, where instead of the rotary thing that goes across, each key is connected to a thing that jams up. But then if you type too fast, they'll actually jam.
Oh my gosh. The challenge, make sure you do one at a time. I'm intriguing now. I need to find a way to get a touch type game up. And then also, thank you so much, Matt. Okay, my final unpopular opinion, yes, I have one, that is to do with the episode, and I thought of it during the episode, so it's truly inspired by the episode, is I don't think that it's realistic to ask product managers to create visions or roadmaps for the future past maximum 2 years, especially if you want to be iterative and you want to actually have it be something that's accurate. Otherwise, you're going to wind up with documents that are a load of hand-wavy, vision-y, grey words about innovation, optimization, that really doesn't tell you anything about what you're actually trying to do, and infinitely frustrate me. So as a product manager, I would like to never be asked to write a vision document. I mean, ideally, it would be a year, 2 in the future, but knowing that that second year is going to be very hand wavy, and don't even tell me you got a 5-year plan. No. That's my unpopular opinion. But it's probably going to be more unpopular with people who want that, and like are product managers. Maybe engineers resonate with that more. But this whole planning for the future, like 2 years max. Like with any certainty, and even then.
All I can say is hear, hear. Speaking to the choir.
Also, it has been an absolute pleasure having this chit chat today. Truly, it's given me a lot to think about. Definitely some fun, unpopular opinions. But I hope that this has been helpful for any of you who are thinking about, struggling with, how do I build for the future? What do I think about? How do I make sure that I'm not building something that's going to get scrapped as throwaway code in a month, 2 months, 6 months, a year from now? We will see you again very soon at our next episode. Have a good day. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.
See you later.
Thank you once again to Jon Sabados for joining us for this episode. So what'd you think? Was that a lot of helpful advice? Do you agree with what Angelica, Jon, and Matt said? Do you disagree? Let us know on social media. This episode of Fall Through was hosted by Angelica Hill with co-host Matthew Sanabria and guest Jon Sabados. Fall Through is produced by Chris Brando and Angelica Hill, and our beats are by Breakmaster Cylinder.